I'm telling you this because my family doesn't want to talk about it anymore. I seem to be the only one who can forget. I grew up on the outskirts of Preston, a small town in southern Idaho with a population of about 5,000. The closest place I lived was an isolated, dead-end dirt road called Bear Creek. There were less than 20 families living on Bear Creek. I didn't mind this isolation. I grew up among spacious fields and close neighbors that only rural people know. We were a Mormon community, very church-oriented, very community-oriented. All the young girls, including me, were members of the women's group, and all the boys were members of the local Boy Scout troop, which in our neighborhood served as a church group at the same time. We had 4th of July parties at the local stadium and swam in the nearby reservoir. It was a nice, quiet village. My house, a 92-year-old farmhouse built by my great-great-grandfather, stood on a small hill, surrounded by a wide grass field on one side and a winding dirt road on the other. Across the road you could see the bottom of a creek. Southern Idaho has a desert climate, so little grows outside the irrigated fields except sage and thorns. The creek bottom was an exception. The creek was fed by dense thickets of willows. In late fall, we would go down to the bottom and collect white, fluffy willow seeds to decorate our driveway fences with. With such a secluded spot, it was not uncommon for animals to come down from the mountains. We had a moose that brought a calf and lived in our garden every winter. Lions were not uncommon either. That summer, when I was 9 years old, a small cougar was seen several times in our neighborhood. We weren't worried. The big cats stayed away from farms and usually left when there wasn't enough food in the neighborhood. That same summer, my neighbor Peyton was working on his Eagle Scout project. He loved National Geographic and thought it would be fun to try to collect National Geographic material about the day-to-day of our little creeks. He was especially excited about a young lion that happened to be in our area at the same time. He decided he wanted to try to photograph the lion, so he emailed the National Geographic team for advice. They recommended setting up an automatic camera that took pictures every couple of seconds at a location the lion was known to visit. They also recommended putting up some sort of bait so that the lion would be more likely to fly up. No one in the creek liked the idea of a live bait or a tumble, so we came up with a different kind of bait. We decided to make an audio recording of a dying rabbit and play it through speakers hidden in the willows. I remember everyone was downstairs checking the speakers and I heard the noise for the first time. The sound of a dying rabbit is horrible. It has been described as almost identical to the sound of a screaming baby. If you've never heard it yourself, there are plenty of recordings available online. It's well worth a listen. The camera was set up. The speakers were tuned. Everything was perfect. Peyton explained that he would let the camera and recordings run continuously for a week and then go and check them. This would give our scent time to fade and encourage the lion to come closer. At first I was concerned about the noise. It was really a terrible noise, and our house was closest to the installation site, at the very bottom. My father assured me that the noise would not reach our house, and I was relieved when we got home in the evening, and he was right. The camera was far enough away that I didn't hear anything. I remember Peyton the next day at church. He was fussing and looking forward to checking out the equipment, but he had to wait a week, as everyone kept reminding him. He couldn't risk going down too soon and spooking the lion forever. On the bed, eyes wide in the darkness and hands clenched so tightly that my palms were still dented with nails for hours. I knew that sound. It was the recording of a rabbit. The sound was faint and distant, as if it really could have come from below. But that was impossible. After all, the recording had gone on all night the night before, and I hadn't heard anything. I didn't sleep that night. I was too scared to get out of bed and wake my parents. The recording repeated over and over again. I memorized the cycle. In the morning, I went to the kitchen to get breakfast. Mom and Dad were sitting at the kitchen table. They too had dark circles under their eyes. I wasn't the only one who heard it. Mom was sure the machinery must have broken. She wanted to go down and check it out. Dad refused. He was a kind, gentle man and didn't want to stir up unnecessary drama. He was sure there was a strong wind blowing last night and it carried the noise farther than he could have. He told us to listen. We listened. He was right. We couldn't hear him now. We forgot about it and went about our daily business. The next night the situation was the same. I remained lying in bed with my back against the wall. The screams were even louder than before, but this time something was different. The sound was lower than I remembered, and parts of the loop were slowed down, as if the recording had been skewed in places. Sometimes the loop wouldn't loop, but would break at a random place in the middle. At breakfast, my mom didn't talk about any of this, but both she and my father looked tense. On the third night I plucked up courage and stood at the bedroom window to look out into the yard. I stood like that for a minute, my hands trembling no matter how hard I squeezed them. There was noise through the slits in the window. I watched the outline of the trees in the yard, completely still. Not even the slightest breeze moved their branches. Mom announced that she was going to visit her sisters in town the next day and would likely stay the night. She invited me to go with her, but I was a daddy's boy at heart and decided to stay on the farm. That night I took Mom's place next to Dad in their bed, but that didn't help either. I guess Dad didn't sleep either, because he was unnaturally still all night. We started hearing noises during the day as well. I was drawing with chalk on the sidewalk when it happened. My shoulders tensed and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. There was only one scream, a short, high one, and then the recording went silent. It repeated several times throughout the day, but not all the way through, just fragments. In the evening, Peyton's father drove up to the house on an ATV. He said he was looking for their dog, who had been missing since that morning. Dad apologized and said we hadn't seen her. I stared at him, silently begging him to mention the tape, but he wouldn't. After all, he was a quiet man. He didn't want to stir up unnecessary drama. Mom was gone for a week. Dad and I didn't sleep. By Saturday, screams were heard constantly, though they seemed completely out of the ordinary. I didn't recognize any of it. Sometimes the screams were thin and prolonged, other times they were nothing more than growls. Once, when my father was heating up meatloaf for dinner, the noise turned into such an angry whoop that he dropped a plate and it shattered. Sitting at the table, I clamped my hands over my ears and squeezed my eyes shut, but it didn't help. The noise came through the gaps in my fingers, squeezing my throat and rattling my ribcage. The noise went on for a full minute, then quieted. Dad was trembling. That was the last time we heard the noise that day. Peyton came in Saturday night to ask permission to cross the road and pick up equipment. He was so excited. Not a minute later, I noticed Peyton coming back from the creek. I was confused. It had taken us much longer to set up the camera and speakers, so I assumed it would take the same amount of time to assemble them as well. My breath caught as Peyton stepped closer. He looked strange. His eyes were wide open and his face was pale. Something wet was dripping off his chin onto his shirt. I later realized it was vomit. My father caught him before he fell and demanded to know what happened. Peyton couldn't speak. He was just crying. We called for his father. My father and Peyton's father went downstairs. They were gone for a long time. When they came back, their faces were grim, and they smelled strange. I noticed a red color on my father's hands. I asked what happened, but they let me pass by and immediately called the police. No one told me what had happened. I sat on the couch with neighbors and police officers circling around me. At one point a policeman put something on the kitchen table and left. I looked into the kitchen with curiosity. It was the camera from downstairs. I wish I hadn't looked. The camera was a little broken. The plastic case was covered with tiny scratches and dents. When I picked it up, my hands stuck to the plastic. Something sticky and smelly covered the screen, but it turned on fine. The first series of photos were normal. Only the willows were green in the night light. As I continued to look through them, they quickly became strange. At one point the camera angle changed, as if the camera had been knocked off the stand. Grass now covered most of the frame. Red spots appeared on the lens. One photograph made me think there was a figure in it, or half a figure, since most of the upper torso was out of the frame. I thought it might be a man, but it didn't look like he was standing upright. His legs were curved like an animal's, and he seemed to have trouble keeping upright. There was a long, thin arm dangling next to its legs. Whatever it was, it must have been hunched over, because the tips of its fingers dangled below its crouched knees. The next set was different. It was as if the camera had been picked up and was now being held. The first photo was at night. The next one struck me. I had to look closely before deciding what it was. There was a rabbit lying in the bushes, but its ears and most of its skull had been torn off. The next one was of the same rabbit, but a thin dark hand was holding it up against the sky. Its helpless body hung as if in a nightmare. In the next pictures, the same rabbit was joined by several other rabbits, each with its ears and scalp removed. Then a cat, then more cats, then a dog, then a lion. The next picture showed 7 rabbits, 3 cats, 1 dog, and a lion lined up in a row facing the same direction. Their arms and legs were arranged as if they were marching, like some kind of parade. All of their scalps were removed and you could see the tiny white reflections of their skulls. The last photo came out too bright, like the photo was taken too close with a flash. The eye dominated the frame, but it was yellowed and crusted, and the pupil had a streak like a horse's. The edge of the mouth was visible in the lower corner. No lips, just teeth, sharp and small, with wide gaps of red rubber between them. I wish I hadn't looked. I heard my father talking to the police outside. They said the speakers were out of order. The recordings only played the first night.